Hi, this is the Unwilling Pawn. I'm continuing with my 9/11 conspiracy theory series and a sub-series, the war in Afghanistan. In the last video, I talked about the foundations or the founders of the war on terrorism, the Zbigniew Brzezinski, Western hegemony, the whole master plan and that sort of thing, the whole Cold War, engineer of the Cold War. I mean, all of this stuff went into the basic foundation of this war on terrorism. But really, we didn't get, it was mostly general stuff, some Afghanistan related. Obviously, the Osama bin Laden's link to Afghanistan, but more total general stuff. Who Osama bin Laden was, a little, not a biography. It was not my focus. In fact, my point was that we shouldn't be focusing on Osama bin Laden. He's just the boogeyman they put out there. So all of this stuff, the background, the information, the understanding of the chronology, undeniable chronology, Osama bin Laden's link to the drug trade, drug trafficking. It didn't start until the CIA and Osama bin Laden got there. That's a historical chronology fact. But what should we focus on rather than is Osama bin Laden a CIA asset or not? All of that stuff. I kind of went into it, some basics, some understanding, and what our focus should be. But really to understand how this war went for 20 years. I mean, how did this happen? There was a lot in there. A lot of reasons for that. And why did the Taliban win? A lot of people have been given this is so much propaganda. When people start believing their propaganda, their lies that they made up in their own home backyard about someone else, then they don't really understand the group, and that they're not able to effectively fight against them. I mean, the ones at the top, they know they made up these lies because they were not there to win any war. They were there just to basically loot the country and loot everything for themselves. So when you live in your own little world, watch your Hollywood movies or whatever your country's propaganda is, and listen to that, and you don't come out of that, and then you go on the ground and you face some real pissed off soldiers, you're going to get a reality check. And the Taliban taking over is one of those big reality checks, not just for America, but for the entire world. A reminder that whatever you thought about the Taliban, maybe it's not so clear. But people have their own opinions and their feelings and their sides that they've chosen. But there's a lot here that just isn't discussed. So we're talking about the original Afghani Taliban. Remember, with the Taliban term, there's others involved. There's others that have taken this name or used some alteration or modification of the Taliban. There's originally Afghani Taliban. There's actual history behind them, with let's say the Tarihi Taliban Pakistan, so the Pakistani Taliban. There's other groups. When you hear the word Taliban, it could just be some pissed off Pakhtun. I mean, that's been one definition of the Taliban. So the original Taliban was a group, and we're going to talk about them. They're the ones in charge again of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is a different group. Other spin-offs of the Taliban are different groups. They may be in this country or that country, and they have their own agenda. So you might demonize the Taliban, say they bombed the school, but I don't know if they bombed it. Was it another mercenary? Was it another group that called them the Taliban? So who were the Taliban? We go back into the history, not the propaganda, not what you've heard, the actual history. How did this war get extended for 20 years? And to understand this, you start with the Taliban. All of the Mujahideen groups were not recruited by Osama bin Laden. They all had their own reasons to fight against the Soviets: Afghani nationalism, Pakhtun pride, Islamic solidarity, and perhaps a host of not-so-noble pursuits like control over the opium poppy, glory on the battlefield, the mercenary business. Obviously, and I think I mentioned this before, but to be declared a Mujahid under this definition and for the purpose of recruiting against the Soviets, if you were willing to take up arms against the Soviets, you're a Mujahid. That's it. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to believe in anything. You could be a total enemy of Islam and you'd be considered a Mujahid, although this is a purely religious term. So they certainly used that to fuel the recruits for the Soviets. The Muslims did, and so did the the CIA. They knew that this is one way to get recruits here. People are willing to fight and die for this cause against the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. In fact, religion was one of the only things they had in common, and even amongst them, they had a wide range of diversity of opinion about the practice of Islam, not to mention that not all of them were deeply religious. So you had every kind of person, every kind of Afghani, taking up arms against the Soviets, and therefore he's a mujahid. He's one of the mujahideen, holy warriors. Afghanistan had not seen stability for many years, even well before the Soviet Union's invasion. But afterwards and since then, chaos has been the only political reality. Afghanis have been searching for an identity, something to unite them, an outlook on life, preservation of their religion and culture. In the midst of this political instability, corruption, social disharmony, war, from these ashes, one of the groups that have risen are the Taliban. I say ashes because the Taliban were not educated in lavish universities with cutting-edge technology. They have never known fun, entertainment, or luxury. They have been largely disconnected from the outside world and isolated, not all by choice. One of the reasons the Taliban are now in control of Afghanistan is that they are the only people interested in actually running the country, not just exploiting it. In spite of their weaknesses, corruption, ignorance, and sometimes downright cruelty, they're the only ones, with very few exceptions, who want the job of establishing law and order in Afghanistan, who won't seek visas or make refugee claims to go and live in other countries, who have been willing to make sacrifices for their country. There have been other Afghanis of starkly opposing viewpoints who wanted to rebuild Afghanistan, to unify it, but they either fell to the tactics of Afghanistan's enemies, the US, Soviets, and others supporting the occupations, or just weren't numerous or determined enough to make a difference. So either they weren't sincere enough, they sold out, they fell to the tactics, or let's say with Hamid Karzai, for example, he was just too Western. He was too westernized. Ashraf Ghani was a different case altogether. He was just, everyone hated him. But Hamid Karzai, his thing was, he wanted to unite it, but he wanted to use you can't use pure Western support and be a Western tool, a Western puppet, and expect Afghanistan to accept you as their own leader. They're not going to do that. And certainly you're going to have a hard time dealing with the Taliban. He, in many of his speeches, said the Taliban are our own people and we need to work with them and everything. So he's shown like some mutual understanding and respect with the Taliban. But the Taliban wouldn't respect him, and they never really worked with him to build a new Afghanistan. They refused to work with him because he's too westernized. So there was some reason or another, there's no other Afghani that could command the loyalty. And of course, all the other invading forces, Gorbachev, genocidal maniac, ordered the genocide of Afghani people because he was getting frustrated and Soviets were not making any progress. And of course, you had America, who we talked about, had its own objectives, whether it was mineral wealth of Afghanistan, oil and gas, drug trade, drug trafficking of CIA and Wall Street. I'm sorry, of the CIA and laundering through Wall Street. So you had that whole business going on. These three main big agendas of America. So exploiters just coming to take advantage. India, Pakistan both have their own agendas, their own reasons why they want. So no one else could come in and rule Afghanistan, and Afghanistan wouldn't be ruled by them. And most of them didn't even care to rule Afghanistan. I think there were some plans in Pakistan to make Afghanistan part of some empire or something. It's all failed strategy, some Central South Asian empire sort of thing, total failed plan. But there were lots of people who were thinking something else. But nobody wanted to actually go in there and go into the ashes and actually fix things up. This is our country. This is our home. And that's one thing that people underestimated and totally misunderstood the Taliban. The lies that you've been told, that's one of the reasons why the just war went on for 20 years and you kept on losing. With the superior technology, everything. They just kept on fighting, Why? What was their motivation? Who are they? Are they really just evil people and, they should just shut up and accept defeat? Or is there something more? Is there more to the story than that? So Afghanistan has been left with the Taliban, for good or for ill. If you compare them with the occupation forces and their allies, the allies of the occupation forces, maybe they don't seem so bad. but for establishing a long-standing working government, making progress as a nation, competing with the economies of the world, enjoying freedoms as a society. You don't want the Taliban's harsh interpretation of Islam, ignorance of modern ways, lack of education, or isolationist mindset dictating policies and shaping the fate of your country. Understanding who the Taliban are exactly is difficult. For one, there are amongst them wise old men who have been fighting since the Soviet invasion, and immature young men who have never seen a carnival before and just had to take a ride on the bumper cars once they took over Afghanistan. They have educated people who have lived abroad and know of the modern world, and many others who have never seen much beyond their own villages. But where do they come from? Let's look at that history. There are many sources that examine the Taliban's history. I refer you to a nice documentary done by the Caspian Report, published in March of 2020. This is a video. Origins of the Taliban is the name of the video. After the Soviets, the link is obviously in my blog. I've given a link to the blog in this video, and you can see the link mentioned within that blog. After the Soviets invaded, they were largely unsuccessful because of the decentralized guerrilla warfare tactics Afghani Mujahideen were using. They would attack at the most opportune times and on the best possible terrain, and then retreat into the mountains where Soviet battle tanks could not follow. When the Soviets sent their gunships to hunt them down, they took casualties early on. But with the arrival of the American Stinger missiles, the Mujahideen would shoot them down. Facing this never-ending struggle, losing, not making any gains, with no foreseeable victory, in their frustration and arrogance, the Soviets began practicing cruelty against all Afghani villages. They couldn't get their hands on the fighters, so they started attacking their families, treating them as enemy combatants. Well, where have you heard that term before? The Soviets killed over 1 million Afghanis, and over 6 million, almost entirely women and children, were forced out of their country, fleeing mostly to neighboring Pakistan and some to Iran. The men stayed and fought the Soviets, being disconnected from their families for many years, facing an enemy that was ready to commit genocide to win. So you have a frustrated Soviets who are like, man, this war is going on forever, and we're not getting anywhere with these guys, and let's just kill their families. Total horrible strategy, genocidal maniac. Gorbachev gave that order, I believe. I believe he was the president or leader of Soviets, but regardless who was, I don't care. The Pakistani people, especially those of Pakhtun origin, supported their Afghani sisters and their children with food, clothing, shelter, medicine, and even education. The Pakistani ISI would support and train new soldiers to send to the Afghani men's aid. This went on, and facing an endless war against a determined people, with support from Pakistan, by proxy America. By 1989, the Soviet Union finally gave in and abandoned their expansion into the graveyard of empires. Upon their exit, the Mujahideen could not agree on how to take Afghanistan forward, and rival factions began turning on each other, destroying the cities that the Soviets even did not, divvying up Afghanistan amongst themselves. Meanwhile, their women and children in neighboring Pakistan faced struggles of their own. Their children lived in refugee camps in Peshawar and Quetta, and many saw madrasas, religious schools, as an excellent escape from the realities of refugee camp life. These madrasas were paid for by the Saudis, and the ISI was interested in them because they served as training grounds to recruit more soldiers for Afghanistan's current and future struggles. Amongst these children were the boys who would later become the Taliban. The Taliban would eventually return to Afghanistan, feeling that it was their duty to restore law, order, and peace. Understand the mindset. Understand the ashes from which they rose. And when you send your little kids there, this is what you're facing. This is what they're facing. They didn't go to a nice university. They didn't go to a nice home. They rose from the ashes, and they're the only ones who give a shit about their country, according to them. They feel this is ours. We're fighting for it. This is our ashes. These are our ashes. And we're going to fight for them till the day of judgment. Come get it. And you send your stupid little kids who have no idea what the hell they're getting into, what the background is. They have no history, no interest. They just heard things on TV and Taliban are evil and this and that. And they've been shown Osama bin Laden's face and terrorist training on monkey bars and all this other childishness. This is all made for TV drama propaganda. When you face the on-the-ground reality, then you have to face the on-the-ground reality. You can't live in your own world of lies, in your little bubble. Come outside of it and face the reality as it is, not as you would like it to be or as you've been told it was. In the years that followed, along with many refugees, the Taliban returned to their original home with education, courage, support, and an outlook to end the madness. Seeing that the Taliban could be successful in unifying Afghanistan and assuming that they would be friendly to Pakistan due to its support and foundation during their tough times, the ISI gave support. The Taliban brought a strict code of laws, punishing murder, theft, and rape by beheading or cutting off limbs. Initially, the people welcomed the stability in the face of the Mujahideen remnants fighting each other and committing horrendous acts against them. So a lot of those people, once they got rid of the Soviets, I mean, they had no working within their families, they were disconnected, they started acting like animals. And they became wrongdoers themselves of people. So the Taliban came in there and basically restored law and order. So initially they won the support of the people. And this is how. However, as the Taliban made gains, including Kabul, the people began to realize that they weren't just bringing them law and order, but they were imposing a strict interpretation of Islamic law, forcing the people to be more religious than they were. Afghanis needed its stability, but they felt that losing all of their freedom and living in harsh warlike conditions was not the life they were aching to return to once the Soviets were forced out of Afghanistan. The Taliban in Afghanistan were largely left to their own after the Americans got what they wanted, the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Pakistan's ISI also felt that they had no control over them once the Taliban got control over almost all of Afghanistan. The last straw for the Afghani people and the foreign renewed interest in Afghanistan was when the Taliban shut down the opium trade that Afghani agriculture had become so dependent upon. The rest, as they say, is history. History we have covered. To some degree here. Obviously, a lot of this has to be summarized because my focus is on something else. Remember, this is all about the 9/11 conspiracy theory. All this background. We're talking about mostly incentive. We were talking about initially the killer. I guess have to summarize it at the end, but we're talking about all these incentives. You say you went in there to fight terrorism, but the reality shows something else. You were the author of that terrorism, and you were behind it all. We'll summarize it, close it, tie it in, but you see, this is all about incentive. Related to 9/11. Okay. Afghani leadership. So who was in contention and who ruled Afghanistan all this anti-Taliban era in this 20 years war? Since the ousting of the Taliban in December 2001, there have been only two leaders who exerted control over Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. We have discussed Hamid Karzai's connections to oil and gas and the US establishment. In spite of this, Hamid Karzai wished to work closer with the Taliban to rebuild Afghanistan, both before and after his presidency. But the Taliban did not trust him due to his Western ties, even before he became a UNICAL consultant. Karzai had more respect for the Taliban because he fought alongside them against the Soviets. He had spent many years in Pakistan, primarily Quetta, along with the other Afghani refugees. He clearly has Indian ties due to receiving his education there and India's support for the anti-Taliban forces during and after his presidency. In May 2001, Karzai told a German newspaper, Der Spiegel, that he sympathized with the Taliban, criticized the role of the US in Afghanistan, and said that Pakistan would be crucial to Afghanistan's future success. This was in May 2001. So, Karzai ruled Afghanistan from 22nd December 2001 to 29th September 2014 and was known for his charisma and desire to unite Afghan communities. He ultimately did not succeed because the Taliban considered his Western links and because he was no longer useful for the U.S. establishment when they saw that he was too pro-Afghani and truly wanted to rebuild his country. And that was not America's intent. America has its own intent. We talked about those objectives. The incentive America had to go in Afghanistan. It had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden being harbored and all this other drama. We've seen the facts, and not just the incentive, but obviously they knew where Osama bin Laden was. All of that counters their narrative, which tells us 9/11, of course, was an inside job. All of this goes well beyond. This is something that Michael Rupert mentioned. He said this again and again. This goes well beyond 9/11. But since we're focusing on the 9/11 conspiracy, you have to get into all this background. This goes well beyond 9/11. But because 9/11 was the biggest and the excuse for all of these crimes, at least in front of the people, we have to cover it. We have to talk about the 9/11 conspiracy theory. But we talked about so much here because you have to. It's all related. Once he lost American support, Karzai's time to rule Afghanistan had come to an end. Karzai was replaced by a Western and Indian tool, my personal opinion about him, Ashraf Ghani, who Karzai declared a traitor after the U.S. 2017 Nangarhar strike. Ghani I didn't get into the history or details of that, but bottom line is Karzai didn't respect Ghani. Ghani was an American citizen along with his wife, who was from a Lebanese Christian family. Ghani did have to renounce his citizenship to take the reins from Hamid Karzai. So he had to renounce his American citizenship so he could become the so-called prime minister, president, whatever, of Afghanistan. Ghani is educated completely from the West and loves India. Since he has spent no time in Pakistan as a refugee like Karzai did, and for other reasons, he has been even more ruthless in his opposition to the Taliban and his constant attacks against Pakistan, reciting the lines given to him by the US and India. On the 15th of August 2021, Ghani displayed his character in front of the entire world by fleeing Afghanistan as the Taliban took over Kabul, frantically loading his wealth, $170 million in cash, and family on his personal helicopter. This after vowing to fight the Taliban till the bitter end. The Russian embassy alleged that Ghani fled with, quote, direct quote, 4 cars and a helicopter filled with cash, end quote, and had to leave some behind since it would not all fit. He traveled in haste, first to Tajikistan and then to UAE, where the government gave him permission out of humanitarian concerns. He is currently, at the time I wrote this initially, he was in late 2021, I think. He was making statements denying that he fled with the money, but he has lost all credibility, even amongst his allies and supporters. These leaders, especially the likes of Ghani, are the main competition to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they are the main reason the Taliban have returned and this time have taken complete control over the country. Why? How did the Taliban come in? Well, who's in their competition? Either outside forces as far as Afghani leadership. All of them puppets of the United States. Puppets. And those puppets can never achieve any loyalty. One was a little more ruthless, like Ashraf Ghani. Well, that's just going to piss the Taliban off even more, and the Afghani people. How did the Taliban gain support? It's because of these idiot leaders. How did the Taliban get support in the first time? Because they were challenging the psycho behavior of the Mujahideen in the first place. So the people looked to them as saviors. They're like, okay, they saved our asses. These guys were psychos committing crimes and now they established law and order. So this is how they gained support the first time. This is how they gain support every time. Who's in competition? People are like asking, how did the Taliban take over? This is how. Understand their background. Understand who's in competition. Who else could run Afghanistan? Who else wants it? Well, no one wants to really run it except maybe some Afghanis, but a lot of them are just exploiters. One guy, okay, Hamid Karzai, you could say he actually wanted to run Afghanistan and unite Afghanistan, but he was too Western for the Taliban to respect him. You can't be an American tool and expect loyalty from non-Western people, especially in the Muslim world. It's not a realistic plan. And it failed badly. Now I get to what I like to call mini-skirt politics. Now I already talked about the feminism for endless war, but what I like to call mini-skirt politics, because all of this, have seen this kind of mentality all over the world, and especially it's been used in Afghanistan. It's been used by pretty much all of the enemies of the Taliban, particularly because the Taliban impose strict Islamic rules. So this whole concept of feminism and miniskirt politics is like what I like to call it. This miniskirt politics has been used by all of the liberal, secularist, anti-Taliban forces amongst the Americans, their allies in India, Pakistan, all of the people. And now I mentioned they had their drug and all the other objectives, but miniskirt politics has been used as the excuse. Feminism has been used as the excuse to keep it. How did this war last for 20 years? Well, this is one of the many reasons. People were supporting, no, we got to keep the Taliban out. Got to keep the Taliban. Why? Well, one of the reasons was what I like to call miniskirt politics. One of the main driving factors of the never-ending war in Afghanistan is women's rights, feminism, and sexual freedom. I say is intentionally. I know the Taliban are back in power, but I also know that the ruling elites of America will never let go of Afghanistan. I remind you of the CIA report that discusses the use of feminism for endless war, exposed by WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, the same one that I shared before, WikiLeaks exposes CIA report, use feminism for endless war. A source I have already referenced earlier in this paper. Every time someone speaks of ending this war, someone else mentions, what about the women? They need us. The Taliban don't respect our ideals. Or something to that effect. In the name of saving Afghani women from their oppressive Muslim extremist overlords, quote unquote, we are being asked to keep fighting the Taliban and their ideology to the very ending of this world. This is not a practical war anymore, because it's an ideological one. At least in the eyes of those who are being used for the war. Not the ones who are the constructs of this war, the founders of this war. They don't give a damn about any of these politics. They just know how to use you because you feel this way or you feel that way. How do I get the Pakistani secularists on my side? How do I get the Indian secularists on my side? How do I get the entire world on my side? Well, feminism, women's rights, sexual freedom, miniskirt politics. So it's a clash of your ideas, not a clash of they don't have any ideas. They don't believe in anything. They believe in nothing. All they want is power. And they'll use whatever you believe against you. The clash of ideas truly never ends, but real life wars must end for all of our sake. These ideology, feelings, and beliefs, and social, all this stuff is going to go on forever. Does that mean the war has to go on forever? Unbelievable. The war is physical. People are dying. It costs money, war, weapons. A country is being ravaged. Sure, I mentioned this before. Afghanis probably take pride, and others take pride in Afghanistan. It's a graveyard of empires. Defeated 2 emperors, or made them submit to defeat. Well, at the cost of what? At the cost of your own country. A country that's been ravaged by war is like a graveyard. Congratulations. Yeah, you fended off the Americans and the Russians, the Soviets. What did you get? A graveyard? Yeah, you're a graveyard of empire, but you're also a graveyard. There's nothing there. Nobody wants to live there. Nobody wants to live in a graveyard. It just reminds them of death. This feminist movement was started in America back in the 50s, with women joining the workforce of the country, getting in touch with their femininity to counter the toxic male chauvinism in society and exploring all avenues of sexual freedom to the point of hedonism. It made its way to Europe and the other industrialized countries in its nation-building and modern form of colonialization, cultural conquest. America has made this movement a practical requirement for all countries under its sphere of influence. Afghanistan being one of them, it is expected that they make transitions to secure Afghani women's rights, bow before feminism, and even allow women to indulge in every sexual fantasy they may have, at least as much as the men are allowed to do. While this may sound good to a lot of people, depending on how liberal you are, it's not as realistic and reasonable a requirement for countries like Afghanistan. In part because they don't agree with this liberal ideology, and they never will. So you're going to keep the war going until the ending of the world. If you can't make the Taliban or Afghanistan liberal like you want, are you going to stay in their country? Does that sound realistic, reasonable, sane? Again, it's an ideological issue. So you're going to keep the war going until what? The ending of the world? They'll never become liberal like that. Are you crazy? That's not happening. It's just an excuse, because basically when you want a deal to fail, so if let's say a used car should cost like $5,000 or something. If you don't want to make the deal, well, you say, well, I want $50,000. Who's going to pay that? That's just your way of saying, I don't want to do this deal. I don't want to sell the car. I need to pretend for some reason that I'm selling the car, but I'm actually not trying to sell it. So that's why I'm making such an unrealistic price that no one's going to pay it. So all we want from the Taliban is to respect women's rights. Really? You deliberately ask for what they will not give, and you know they won't give it, so you can keep justifying the war till the ending of the world. And is feminism even good for women in society? Well, I think that depends on how you define feminism, what it entails. The women of the West have their own social struggles and historical background, because of which feminism became a reality in their culture in the US and Europe. However, the women of Eastern cultures, including Afghanistan, had a different history, not suffering the same oppression that women in Europe suffered so many centuries ago. And again, in America after it became a country. You can't just apply the feminism of the West to countries with a completely different history and mindset and expect it to yield the same results. If feminism empowers women to fight for their rights and improves their quality of life, then we should be all for it. But if it emboldens women to disrespect and cheat every man, including their own father, who raised them with love and care, their husbands, brothers, cousins, etc., if it encourages women to curse their creator for making them the weaker sex, if it makes them bitter rather than understanding the social and psychological advantages that being a woman has for them and society, if it turns them into the most despicable and ungrateful vixens the world has ever seen, then no, I'm not for it, nor should any sensible person be. Because women of other countries did not suffer what Western women suffered throughout their history in Europe and America, they are not embracing feminism nobly. Rather, they are getting greedy for power, sadistic and anti-male, hedonistic in lust, treacherous in relationships, and downright evil in their bond with their own parents and their Creator, God. Let's get real for a moment. By acknowledging that this has far less to do with ideology. So I talked about the idea. We can talk about the ideology. You can discuss it. You can give your opinion. I can give my opinion. But this has nothing. This is real war we're talking about. You're going to end the war and for this discussions and debates? A bullshit excuse. Now let's get real for a moment by acknowledging that this has far less to do with ideology than it does with materialistic and carnal pursuits. Sure, there are women who actually believe in their feminism, and there are men who seriously believe in these liberal ideals. However, most of popular culture is not interested in preserving the rights of women and improving the quality of their lives, but rather exploiting them. Look carefully at popular shows. I could mention one. I think I mentioned Family Guy and many others. So many others. It's not right to target one show. How many times have you heard mentioned that victory for democracy yields women wearing bathing suits or miniskirts instead of long gowns and Islamic niqab or burqa? I recall an episode of one of these shows, I forget which one, where two girls were wearing niqabs and then the narrator said something about democracy winning, and in the next frame, the girls were wearing bathing suits, lying on the cars and touching each other as if they were about to perform a sexual act in a steamy pornographic video. Funny, sure, if you're in the mood for that kind of comedy, but there is something telling about all of this. It exposes what the liberals really want from Muslim countries. And I'm not just talking about the liberals of the West, but also the liberals of India and Pakistan and Afghanistan. I can't recall how many different liberal analyses of Afghanistan and its history I have heard. Just on YouTube you can find these videos, where Indian or Pakistani liberals hearken to the great times of Afghanistan when women were wearing miniskirts. So it's all about the almighty miniskirt. Sharing pictures prior to the Soviet invasion. Are they really interested in the women's education, safety, security, rights, future, happiness, or do they just want their blood to rise like it does during the state of sexual excitement? When a man aches to see women dress sexy, fawn on their beauty, curves, seductive or slutty demeanor, everything that turns us men on about women, are we really interested if she is eating well, or whether her education is paid for, or she is happy with her life? Honestly, are we in the right state of mind to care about her like her father would? When you check women out, lust after them, is that for their own good or for your own pleasure? Who were you kidding that this was all for the women? Do you really want to save them, or are you just tired of gratifying yourself looking at the women of your own country and looking for an exotic treat? Be honest. Let's cut the crap. That's why I said let's get real for a second. This is not even an ideology. There's discussion to be had there. But nobody really cares about ideology. It's all made for TV drama. All of this is a distraction. This is how a war goes on for 20 plus years. Never-ending wars. This is how it happens. Keep people busy in these debates and discussions. And keep using that as justification, because that is a debate that's never going to end. That's a war that's never going to end. Now let's get serious. As for the liberals of India and Pakistan, many of them hate people of Pakhtun origin. There's a history, but I can't justify that statement here just in one statement, but I can give you the background. There's lots of background to be in. Their racism is deep-rooted, and it stems from the ideological, liberal versus conservative, religious, modern Islam or modern Hinduism versus conservative Islam, and ethnic differences, descendants of Vedic civilization versus descendants of Indo-Iranian civilization. So Pakhtun origin has to do with more Irani roots, but Pathan are an essential part of, or have made their way into Indo-Pak culture. So there's lots of Indianized Pathan, Urdu speaking, Hindi speaking, Punjabi speaking Pathan all over. Many of them hide the fact that they're Pathan, but there's many Pathan who have become Indianized, is what I like to call it. And of course, I think one of the countries at that time, when this was before Afghanistan was even a country, the great King Ashoka, he conquered what is now known as Afghanistan. So this area, they all have links to each other. There are genetic links, no doubt. Some say the Aryan races, they started from Central Asia and so on and so forth. Okay, whatever. That's too far back. But in terms of cultural development, the Pathan are a little bit different. And they do have slightly different blood. But there's a relation and connection there. So it creates this racist mindset that Pathan are like nomadic type people. So here, those are the four main differences. Ideological, liberal versus conservative. Religious, the Pathan are more conservative people than we are. Religious, modern Islam versus modern Hinduism versus conservative Islam. Ethnic differences, descendants of the Vedic civilization versus descendants of Indo-Iranian civilization. As well as intellectual arrogance, civilized versus nomadic. These Pathan, they're dirty nomads, and we're the intelligent part of the Indian subcontinent. We're civilized, we're smart, they're dumb. Now, this is apart from the fact that many Pathan are doctors, engineers, so forth. When a culture wants to survive, they have to do everything. They can't just be laborers or fighters or something else. Now, why do people who so vehemently hate the Pathan, what Indians call the Pakhtun, have such a vested interest in the welfare of their women, or their culture, or their country? Same thing with the United States. When you look down at everyone who's not American, who's not Western, who's not Anglo-Saxon, they're all your enemies. Especially people from the third world, or turban-wearing towel heads. Now all of a sudden you deeply love their women? Somehow I'm not buying the bullshit. You want to commit genocide against their own people. You'd like them to be wiped off the planet. But you deeply love their women? I smell bullshit here. Many of these racists hate Pathan so much that they wish to commit genocide against them. They wish all the Pathan would die gruesome deaths. These same monsters are pretending that they want to rescue Afghani women. Am I to believe in the sincerity of these concerns? And what about the Americans who look down at all Eastern cultures, regarding them as less than human, portraying them as beasts rather than their fellow man? Am I to believe they really deeply care about women of some Afghanistan? No, all they care about is miniskirt, cleavage, hotness, sexuality, freedom, sexy legs, ample breasts, nice curves, slutty girls, exotic treats. What I've seen in these past 20 years is people lying right through their teeth about their deep concern of another people, all the while committing human rights violations against all of their people. Hellfire missiles, drone attacks, carpet bombings, etc. How many little boys and girls and adults lose life and limb from the US soldiers shooting up the place looking for terrorists, so-called, or enemy combatants, just like Gorbachev did? How many schools and other infrastructure are destroyed when the US bombs everything to hell? What do you think happens to the economies of these countries when the US attacks repeatedly, insist on imposing sanctions? And they're still doing that right now. We can't support a Taliban-based government, impose sanctions, starve them all to death. They have no economy. How do you expect them to have an economy? They've been fighting you, and prior to that, the Soviet Union. Fighting for the past 40, 50 years, plagued by war. They're going to have an economy? The US was quick to demonize the Soviet Union for the atrocities they committed during their attempted occupation of Afghanistan. What about now that the US is trying to occupy? What I have seen is these liberals and humanists, so-called, quote-unquote, hating a people viscerally. I've heard that word on Fox News. Visceral hate. And that means I hate you because my very guts tell me to hate you. I hate you no matter what. I hate you. I hate your people. My liver, my stomach, my insides are telling me to hate you. My very blood is telling me to hate you. Visceral hate. And yet professing up and down how much they are there to nation build and improve the conditions of human rights. It's almost as if the liberals with vested interests in Afghanistan are saying to the people, either let all of your women wear miniskirts and dress as sexy as they can, or else I will bomb you to hell. Men with their tongues hanging out, their mouths watering, demanding the men of a country to quit oppressing, quote-unquote, their women and let them wear miniskirts, or else they'll impose economic sanctions, commit human rights violations, destroy what little infrastructure the country has, and even threaten them with genocide. This going on for 20 years. This is what I like to call miniskirt politics. Soldier Testimonies. Let's hear from a soldier. Why did this war fail? How did this war go on for 20 years? Let's go back to the RT's interview of Major Swanson, who discusses America's defeat in Afghanistan. Same video I shared before, referred to. I only briefly mentioned it and didn't discuss it in detail. I'm going to do that now. On Contact, the debacle in Afghanistan. Daniel A. Swanson graduated from West Point Academy. He has an MA, Master's in American History. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He is the co-host of the podcast Fortress on a Hill. He is the director of the Eisenhower Media Network. He is the author of the book A True History of the United States, and he is a combat veteran from Iraq and then Afghanistan, serving as a captain in command of B Troop in Kandahar province from 2nd February 2011 to January 2012. He bears testimony that General Stanley McChrystal, International Security Assistance Force Afghanistan, ISAF, commander, 2009 to 2010, and General David Petraeus, all people you've probably heard of in the news, ISAF commander, 2010 to 2011, were feeding the American people nothing but lies. He recalled that Petraeus and all of his subordinates tried already failed tactics they used in Iraq again in Afghanistan, like turning Sunnis against Shia, which made especially less sense in Afghanistan as that was never an issue of contention within the country. He was shocked that the Taliban never prevented their fellow Afghans from doing work for the Americans, like infrastructure work or civil contracts, even if it was perceived by Danny Swartzen to help the U.S.'s cause. So his commanders would tell him, build a bridge here or something. And he would get the local Afghanis working on it, and some of them would say, we'll have to get permission from the Taliban. Taliban's giving their enemies, go ahead, build a bridge. Because it would be good for the people. Oh, but it's also going to help our military trucks get across. It's going to help our logistics. Aren't you worried about that? Aren't you trying to stamp the enemy out at no matter what? And he was saying, his contention was, he's like, he didn't fear us. They're like, okay, we live here. You're just here. You're guests. You'll be gone tomorrow. That what mindset was the Taliban's mind. This is our home. So this proved to him that 1, the Taliban did not fear the Americans. Number 2, they wanted to develop Afghanistan and facilitated people to provide for their families. And 3, they used these opportunities to make income by taxing so that they could keep their operations alive. Locals would often do half-ass work or just pretend to work, but Swartzen was told to give out lots of money to buy their loyalty. So he was reporting that these guys aren't working. I'm giving them money. I'm giving lots of money here, but they're not doing anything. They're just pretending to work so they can make money off. They're making fools of us. But his bosses was like, okay, don't worry. Because like when it's not your money, when it's the American money, it's somebody else's piggy bank, it doesn't affect you. And like if it's your company and you have a bunch of layabouts sitting there and making money for nothing, obviously you're going to be upset about this. But when it's not your money and it's like, you're just getting unlimited money to do whatever you want, you're not paying for it. It's not coming out of your bank account. So look how casual they were with American tax money. Like, just buy the loyalty. Don't worry about it. We know they're pretending to work. Don't worry about Danny Swartzen. Just do your job, man. Don't worry about it. Buy the loyalty. Use this as an opportunity to buy the loyalty. Think of it that way. That's what you're using the money for. You're not using the money for their great work, but you're using the money to buy the loyalty. The money. It's not your money. You don't have to worry about it. He said that the Taliban, with far less ammunition and militia, initiated 99% of the attacks, with Swartzen and his troops constantly having to change stations and react. This was in part due to the fact that the local Afghans were not willing to work for American soldiers as informants. He bears testimony that he and his soldiers fought the Taliban at best to a draw, never winning, but fear of job and career loss and other retribution from the military-industrial complex kept the lie alive for 20 years, that America was winning or a complete victory was in sight. He had to repeatedly give false, glowing reports about America's success in Afghanistan. There was a lot of wink-nod going on when all of his superiors knew that there would never be any victory against the Taliban. The military-industrial complex didn't care about the effectiveness of the war, just the illusion of due diligence. They knew the war was a lost cause but needed to keep cashing in on the war machine. American consultants, oil, security, military, etc., and politicians are the only ones who benefited from this failed occupation. The American people lost trillions of dollars, their loved ones, and earned hatred that will last for centuries. The generals and other high-ranking officers were also rife with corruption, stealing tax dollars by using ghost soldiers to send a bigger bill to the U.S., pocketing all of the money. Again, it's not your money. Loot. Write off big bills. Those supposedly loyal, righteous generals fighting for the truth, justice, and the American way. Spreading democracy to the desert. These are the kind of dialogue we've heard from media. Democracy to the desert. I was giving democracy to the desert. And there was no human rights victories either. Afghani anti-Taliban forces like Northern Alliance warlords and immoral American officers had a general occupation tone. dealing with the Pashtun villages, and they routinely committed human rights violations like murder, beating, torture, child bride, slavery, and rape of women and children. He mentioned something about a Bacha Bazi party, that he was invited to that nonsense. So some of these nasty people, these are the people who are all anti-Taliban. So again, if you want to know, like, how did the Taliban take power again? How did this war last for 20 years? Well, this is why. You commit human rights violation. He mentioned that this also helped the Taliban propaganda, or the pro-Taliban propaganda. This is why the people turned to the Taliban. This is why they turned to him the first time, this is why they turned to him the second time, turned to him a third time, as many times as they need to. Again and again, Taliban. Taliban are our only savior from these monstrosities, from these atrocities that were committed against our people. First, the Gorbachev committing genocide against our people. The Mujahideen fought for us, saved our country. Then we were able to go back to our country. Then you had the Mujahideen fighting each other. The Taliban saved us. So you have to understand the mindset here. What kind of ashes? And from those ashes, how the Taliban rose. Simplistic, oversimplistic mindsets, they don't help you achieve. And then you just sit there and cry about, why did we lose? Why did we lose? How is it possible? This is how it's possible. Bacha Baz party was a boy rape party fueled by hash, where they basically just, they did hash and whatever, and they just raped a boy. It's disgusting, evil stuff. In addition to America's top brass deciding to drop Hellfire missiles. So the idea was, again, what human rights committing human rights violations, and how you're going to win the trust of the people. This is something that Zbigniew Brzezinski also mentioned. I think I'm going to get to that in a second. Much of this was routine practice for many of these warlords, and they had been doing it since the 80s and prior, when America was supporting them. There were, of course, no calls to invade Afghanistan then. The hypocrisy. When you need the Afghanis for this, then you tolerate all of their wickedness. But when you want to use that wickedness against them, well, you propagate, tell your people, hey, that's why I'm there. I'm here to save the women. I'm here to save the women and children. All of the atrocities Americans, Indians, and others accuse the Taliban of, and these are the big voices, anti-Taliban voices. They had their agendas. There's been anti-Taliban voices in Pakistan, but there's also pro-Taliban voices in Pakistan as well. So, as a country as a whole, I would say America is mostly anti-Taliban, pretty much all of it, and Indians also very anti-Taliban as a country as a whole. So you're going to hear the most anti-Taliban voices from these two places. All of the atrocities, and they were most upset about America leaving. Very upset and very disappointed and discouraged. All of the atrocities Americans, Indians, and others accused Taliban of, they did far worse. And what they accused the Taliban of, we can't confirm or deny, because the sources are so untrustworthy. As Zbigniew Brzezinski noted, during the Obama administration, at the beginning of the occupation, America sent very few troops and relied on Afghani alliances to overthrow the Taliban. As the years went by and human rights violations were committed, the Taliban recruited more and more to their side, and as a result, America sent more and more troops with decreasing success, culminating into the debacle that we have all witnessed. More social testimonies. This was all from Danny Swarson and some other, but mostly from Danny Swarson. I mentioned before, you can get people from your own family. I mean, people who lived. Many people have told me on but they're not big characters. Nobody knew them in a show or something, and nobody discussed it. Those particular testimonies, but everyone has their own cases. Many people, and they can bear testimony to what happened. Those who actually went to Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere else in the Muslim world. In a session with Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball, an Afghani war veteran discusses the war in Afghanistan and much more. And I gave the link here in the blog, obviously. Afghanistan War Vet Tells All. He explains that you must look at all of the wars in the Muslim world that America is waging together to get the bigger picture. In other words, you can't look at America's war in Afghanistan without looking at the wars in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. He expressed how misinformed soldiers fighting by his side were about the conflict zones they were being sent to. How misinformed soldiers fighting by his side were about the conflict zones they were being sent to, the lies told by the politicians and high-ranking officers of the military, and how they deal with the depression when they come home, if they come home. And lastly, he said what many have said throughout history: when soldiers are forced into conflict that no one understands because it is sold to the people on a pack of lies, they end up fighting for each other rather than for any cause. In another video of Purple Heart veterans who fought in Afghanistan, Purple Heart veterans on U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is the name of the video, it is clear that the American soldiers were conflicted on why they were there. It is clear that they latched on to each other as their cause and actually started believing that they were doing some good. It is clear that they knew that without that self-delusion, they may be one of the many U.S. vets who would go home and kill themselves because they were fighting for nothing but evil. As Kyle discusses in the video, many of the Northern Alliance, America's allies, had child sex slaves, badly abused women, committed war crimes against the Pashtun tribes, and a host of other atrocities. He expressed sympathy for the soldiers, but said the cold, hard truth: you were lied to, you were used and abused. He makes an excellent point, Kyle does. Are you going to destroy more lives, waste another $8 trillion of taxpayer money, exploit natural resources, earn more hatred from many countries by perpetuating wars in the Muslim world, all in order to honor the memory of your dead comrades? Kyle Kulinski reiterates why America was in Afghanistan, everything we've already discussed from a myriad of sources, and calls out neocon being portrayed as an objective on-the-ground source, calls out the neocon on Fox News, I believe, being portrayed as an objective on-the-ground source, pretending the U.S. was in Afghanistan for honorable reasons, and how the sky is falling as soon as the U.S. withdrew. Quote-unquote straight reporter goes full neocon imperialist propagandist. Okay, so this the next section, there's another section still. So there's war, this Western hegemony, this under the umbrella of this section. First I talked about the war on terrorism, the big neighbor Brzezinski, and all that, Eurasia, master planning. Really, this is part of that Western hegemony, the 20-year Afghanistan war. But in this video, obviously I talked about how this war got extended for 20 years. Sure, there's the master plan and this and that, but how did it happen on the ground? Like, why did the people support it? Why did Americans support it? Why did Afghani support it? Those who supported. How did the Taliban come in? Who were the Taliban? Understanding this background, how did this war go on for 20 years? You have to understand that background. So that's what this video was all about. It is still under Western hegemony, and I'm going to do one final video on this topic. And then I'm going to close off at least the American interest in Afghanistan with a section that I like to call military-industrial complex. So that's the next video. I'm going to talk about Eisenhower's farewell address and general warmongering that has happened since then, and everything that he said Americans should avoid, Americans did not avoid. And we have this military-industrial complex. In that video, of course, we're going to talk about the generals and how much money they made, all of that stuff. This video has gotten long enough as well, so I'm going to close it off in the final video, in the third video of this Western hegemony section. And then I'll close it off and talk about, of course, the war in Afghanistan and 9/11, at America's interest. Now, initially, I had talked about doing a thing on India and Pakistan rivalry, and I briefly mentioned it mainly with the drugs, and the drugs were the main thing. I mean, incentives. Pakistan has other objectives and so on and so forth, and India has other objectives. So there's other stuff there besides the drug trade that includes India, Pakistan. But in order to get to that, I know I mentioned there was an important part of this paper, but I'm not going to be able to do that. It's like a project in and of itself. To understand why, you have to get into the history of India, Pakistan, and that goes many, many centuries, because it has to do with Muslim versus Hindu and this and that. There's a lot of, Hindu versus Muslim in this case. The Hindutva movement, who are the Indians, all of this stuff. It's a whole separate project in and of itself. I'd initially done all that research, and I was like, okay, I'm going to put this, but the paper is going to get ridiculously long. It's already long enough, and then it's all relevant in my opinion, because this is America's war. But just suffice it to say that India, Pakistan had lots of reasons for wanting Taliban out, and some who support Taliban, mostly on the Pakistan side. So you had objectives there, social agendas. I mentioned the whole miniskirt politics, that liberalism and secularism, that existed in Pakistan as well, and that's one of the reasons why people in Pakistan. So Afghanistan is a part of the world, Central South Asia. So both have vested interest, and both want Afghanistan to be more like them, socially, politically, in every way. To be as religious as they are, not more, not less. Both have that mindset. But I'll get into this. I'll close it off in the final video, and I'll just talk about, summing all this up, tying this all of this in. We don't have that much content to cover, but mainly the generals. All the money they made, who got appointed to what. My God, these people made a killing off this. And when you look at this, I myself was surprised initially when I first saw that. I was like, okay, I didn't expect this. I thought all of America was united against the common terrorist Muslim enemy. But it turns out that that's the way it is with dishonorable things, right? Dishonorable money, dishonorable war. Nobody's really doing the right thing, and nobody cares about doing the right thing. All they want is to make the almighty dollar. It's all that matters. It's all about money. It's all about the Benjamins. The hell with the people who will make endless war on earth. Money, 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 money. They made all these trillions of dollars. Where did this money go? They went to the defense contractors. Yeah, they had to actually pay for soldiers and equipment and everything. You think they didn't make profit? From that $8 trillion or $6 trillion or $12 trillion or $10 trillion. How many trillions they spent on the Muslim wars? You'd think the military-industrial complex didn't make money? Oh, they made money. They made a killing off of you. We'll talk about that in the next video. So thanks for watching. Do share the awareness, knowledge. If you have something to contribute, feel free and give me a comment or whatever, and I'll try to take it as positive criticism or whatever it is. Whatever you want to share, feel free. And like, share, subscribe. Thanks for watching. This is The Unwilling Pawn.